Welcome to this presentation on exercise in type 1 diabetes from the Edinburgh Centre for Endocrinology and Diabetes. The advice in these slides is based on extensive experience and research, but at an individual level responses to exercise will vary, so it's important to check your blood glucose regularly to establish what your own response is and also to see which of the strategies discussed here are most suited to the exercise you're doing. And if you have any uncertainty at all, you should contact your diabetes specialist team. We'll begin by discussing different ways of giving insulin. Most people with type 1 diabetes are on basal bolus insulin regimens, which are also known as multiple daily injections. These are designed to mimic as closely as possible the pattern of insulin which is present in people who do not have diabetes, which is a low background level of insulin punctuated by peaks of insulin secretion when food is ingested. With basal bolus insulin, the background cover is provided by long-acting insulins like Lantus or Levemir, which can be given once or twice a day. Twice daily background is often better as it results in less variability and also allows targeted reduction of the background insulin following prolonged exercise. People on insulin pumps have very similar insulin profiles to basal bolus, but have the added advantage of more flexible adjustment of their basal background insulin levels, and this is provided by a constant infusion of quick-acting insulin. Very few people with type 1 diabetes are on twice daily mixed insulins anymore, and that's because this is a quite inflexible type of insulin administration. People on pumps have the ability to adjust the basal rate, and in the example in this slide, the person has 5 different basal insulin rates. The pump delivers boluses of quick-acting insulin with meals based on the carbohydrate content and also the current blood glucose level. Most people using pumps are able to take part in contact sports, and the pump can be removed for short spells, for example during swimming. Moving on to different types of exercise, either aerobic or anaerobic. The most important thing when it comes to exercise in type 1 diabetes is to choose something which you enjoy. Exercise is divided into 2 main types: aerobic exercise, often described as where you can talk but couldn't sing whilst you're doing it, things like walking, cycling, jogging and swimming, or anaerobic, where maximal effort is expended which you couldn't sustain over a long period of time, things like weightlifting and sprinting. Many sports combine a mixture of anaerobic and aerobic exercise, and the distinction here is important because the body responds differently to each type. This is another categorization of types of exercise. So aerobic, moderate intensity exercise would include things like jogging and swimming. Anaerobic, intense exercise would be things like sprint running or sprint swimming. Mixed exercise would be things like football and rugby and tennis. And intense aerobic exercise would be things like middle distance running and cycling, running with hills. You can also look at the different types of exercise by the effect they have on your heart rate, and the targets here are different for each age bracket. Moderate intensity exercise is the type which raises your heart rate to between 50 to 85% of the predicted maximum. So if you were 40 years old, this would be anywhere between 90 to 153 beats per minute, as you can see on the table. But it is worth pointing out these are averages and it may vary for individuals. VO2 max is the maximum capacity of an individual to consume oxygen and is a marker of aerobic physical fitness. Target heart rates of between 50 to 85% of maximum are a level at which most people will be exercising aerobically. Exercise more strenuous than this tips over the anaerobic threshold. This is different for everyone and is much higher in elite athletes. Studies quoted later on in this presentation often exercise people to about 40% of their maximum VO2, which is aerobic exercise. Prolonged aerobic exercise tends to cause a fall in blood glucose levels, approximately 1 millimole for every 10 minutes if no action is taken. The fall in blood glucose is greater with increased duration and increased intensity of activity. The fall in blood glucose is caused by glucose being used by contracting muscles at a greater rate than it can be produced by the liver. This is because in people with diabetes who are taking insulin, excess insulin prevents the liver from producing enough glucose to replace the glucose being used. In people who don't have diabetes, insulin levels drop automatically to allow the liver to produce glucose. You can see on the figure here that because glucose use in the muscle, which is the green line, is greater than glucose production from the liver, represented by the blue line, blood glucose levels, the orange line, start to fall. Counter-regulatory hormones are hormones which cause glucose to rise, but they take a long time to act in aerobic exercise. Short intense exercise, which is anaerobic, is different and can often cause blood glucose levels to rise. This is because anaerobic exercise uses less glucose and the counter-regulatory hormone response is quicker and more marked. Hormones like adrenaline, glucagon, cortisol and growth hormones stimulate the liver and other organs to produce glucose. You can see in the figure that due to the quick rise in counter-regulatory hormones, glucose production from the liver, represented by the blue line, exceeds glucose use, the green line, and so blood glucose levels in total rise as represented by the orange line. There are many factors which can also influence the body's response to exercise. Competition can often cause greater counter-regulatory hormone production and increased blood glucose levels than non-competitive exercise. Upper body exercise is more likely to cause a rise in blood glucose levels than lower body exercise. Mixed sports, depending on the timing and duration of the anaerobic and aerobic components, can have different impacts. Hypoglycaemia prior to exercise reduces the counter-regulatory hormone production and increases the risk of further hypoglycaemia. Every individual is different when it comes to exercise. And finally, the environment, for example, increased heat resulting in quicker insulin absorption or changes related to altitude. We're going to go on now and look at a number of studies which have been done in people with diabetes to look at the effects on glucose levels. This is a study looking at moderate or intense exercise and its effect on blood glucose. The chart to focus on here is the top panel A, which shows blood glucose over time. The grey box is the 30-minute exercise period. People with type 1 diabetes were either exercised constantly at moderate intensity, aerobic, for 30 minutes on an exercise bike, and that's the green highlighted line, or did 30 minutes of aerobic exercise but punctuated by 4 seconds of maximum intensity sprinting every 2 minutes, which is the blue highlighted line. The decline in glucose is less with intermittent high-intensity exercise compared to consistent moderate exercise during the exercise period and the recovery period, which is the following 60 minutes. There is still a risk of delayed nocturnal hypoglycemia with intermittent high-intensity exercise, as is the case for moderate intensity exercise. The suggestion from this study was that doing resistance anaerobic exercise first resulted in a less pronounced fall in glucose during the aerobic exercise and more stable glucose levels in the hour following exercise. In the same study, they looked at what happened over a longer period, including overnight, by using continuous glucose monitoring. You can see that people who did resistance anaerobic work first had more stable glucose levels in the lead up to bedtime. That is, not falling quite as sharply, and were therefore less prone to dropping low overnight. In this study, a short 10-second sprint prior to 20 minutes of aerobic cycling was associated with a smaller fall in glucose in the recovery phase. So again, suggesting that a brief spell of anaerobic exercise reduces the fall in glucose in the subsequent period. This study is almost identical to the previous one, but the sprint was done for 10 seconds after 20 minutes of aerobic cycling. The effect here seems even more impressive in keeping the blood glucose levels steady in the 2 hours following exercise. So to summarise, exercise-related factors: aerobic exercise tends to cause a fall in glucose levels, anaerobic exercise often causes an initial increase in glucose levels, and with aerobic exercise there is a significant risk of overnight hypoglycemia unless adjustments to insulin are made, and we'll discuss this in more detail later. Sprints before or after exercise may reduce this fall in glucose, and team sports can have variable effects depending on the intensity, the position, and whether it's competitive rather than training. Moving on now to some of the practical aspects of adjusting insulin in type 1 diabetes, including pre-meal insulin adjustment, starting levels of glucose, pump basal rates, nighttime basal insulin adjustments, and carbohydrate intake during and after exercise. When thinking about this, it can be useful to understand a little bit about how the body regulates its energy supply. After eating, the body is provided with a large supply of fuel, mainly glucose, which it needs to store for use between meals. Insulin promotes storage of energy in the liver and uptake into other tissues like muscle, where energy is also stored. Glucose stored in muscle cannot leave the muscle to prevent hypoglycemia. During exercise, in people who don't have diabetes, insulin levels fall and counter-regulatory hormones like glucagon and cortisol rise to cause release of glucose from the liver to fuel muscle power. Adrenaline and a fall in insulin also cause release of a different type of fuel from fatty acids, to power the muscles as well. In type 1 diabetes, insulin levels are almost always too high to allow the liver to produce glucose adequately during exercise. Often in type 1 diabetes, the counter-regulatory hormones are also reduced, further diminishing glucose supply. Counter-regulatory hormone production is reduced for around 24 hours after a hypo, which also increases the risk of further hypoglycaemia, especially in the context of exercise. Starting with a very high blood glucose will not help because your blood does not contain enough glucose to meet demand. Even a blood glucose of 15 only contains around 25 grams of glucose, which would be enough to perform moderate exercise for around 12 minutes. So that isn't the answer to preparing for exercise, and hopefully some of the subsequent slides will give an indication of what the best approach actually is. So first of all, looking at adjusting insulin and the quick-acting or bolus insulin. This is quite a busy slide, but it's basically showing the effect of reducing the quick-acting insulin dose for a meal which was eaten 90 minutes before 4 different types of exercise. Example 1 is 60 minutes of exercise at 25% of VO2 max. In someone taking the normal dose of Humalog, there's a drop of about 3 millimoles of glucose, whereas reducing the dose to 50% of usual has kept things stable. In example 2, 60 minutes of exercise at 50% VO2 max, taking 50% of the normal dose is still too much, whereas reducing to 25% of the normal dose has resulted in less of a fall in glucose, although it is a bit higher later on. In example 3, it's 30 minutes of exercise at 50% VO2 max, taking 50% of the normal Humalog dose has worked well here, whereas taking the normal dose has caused a fall in glucose. And finally, example 4 is 30 minutes of exercise at 75% of VO2 max. Here, taking 25% of the normal dose has been the better option than keeping the normal Humalog dose. If you're exercising within 90 minutes of a meal, this table gives some approximate suggestions about how much you should reduce the dose of bolus quick-acting insulin by. So for exercise, aiming for a heart rate 60 to 80% of maximum, things like jogging and swimming. If that was to be a 30 minutes duration, a 50% reduction in dose would be appropriate, whereas longer duration, 60 minutes, would be a 75% dose reduction. For very intense exercise with a predicted heart rate over 80%, things like intense aerobic exercise and squash, then 30 minutes would bring with it a recommendation for a reduction of 75%, and 60 minutes would be a recommendation for a 90% reduction in dose. Moving on now to carbohydrate intake before, during and after exercise. This is a rough guide on what to do prior to exercise, but as with everything else, it's important to check carefully to determine what works best for you. Below 4 or above 15, the recommendation would typically be to delay exercise and treat the lower high glucose as normal. And if above 15, consider checking ketones, and if positive, give a full correction and do not exercise, whereas if the ketones are negative, consider giving a half correction and then proceeding to exercise. If blood sugars are between 4 and 8, then the recommendation would be to take around 20 grams of glucose. If they're between 6 and 8, to take around 10 grams of glucose. And if blood sugars are between 8 and 15, the recommendation would be to start exercising without any supplemental carbohydrate. During exercise, you should aim to replenish your carbohydrate stores by taking glucose. This is particularly important during prolonged exercise to avoid hypoglycemia. If muscle glucose stores are depleted, they will take in glucose later on, leaving you at risk of delayed hypoglycemia. And the table here gives recommendations based on the individual's weight and the degree of activity taking place, recommending replacement every 30 minutes during activity. It's best to take glucose intermittently during exercise than front-loading a large amount at the beginning, and the effect is displayed here on this figure. If you take it intermittently, you avoid that initial large peak of glucose. Immediately after exercise, your blood glucose may transiently rise or remain steady, but in the next 1 or 2 hours after exercise, you may experience hypoglycemia due to ongoing muscle uptake of glucose. To prevent this, it's recommended that carbohydrates taken immediately after exercise, along with a reduced dose of insulin. It's also important to consider how best to avoid delayed hypoglycemia after exercise. Delayed hypoglycemia overnight following exercise is common. This is due to increased muscle insulin sensitivity for around 6 to 48 hours after exercise, meaning the same amount of insulin will cause a larger fall in glucose across this time period. People with diabetes use more muscle glycogen but less liver glycogen and fat than those without, so this needs to be adequately replaced with carbohydrate to prevent fatigue. It's also recommended that there's a reduction in the overnight basal insulin following prolonged exercise and consideration of taking a long-acting carbohydrate snack before bedtime. It is worth carefully assessing whether you're at risk of delayed nocturnal hypoglycemia by checking a 3 o'clock in the morning glucose level on a few occasions after exercise, or looking at this on continuous glucose monitoring if you have that facility available. Typically speaking, a reduction in basal insulin overnight of around 20% is often appropriate. This is a study which assessed the effects of reducing the background insulin dose to 80% of usual, that is a 20% reduction, and you can see that that resulted in less of a fall in glucose levels overnight, thereby reducing the risk of nocturnal hypoglycemia. Moving on now to features available in those using insulin pumps. There are a number of potential benefits of pump use in people who exercise, including the ability to reduce or suspend the basal insulin infusion in advance and during exercise where appropriate, and also to adjust the basal rate following exercise to help prevent nocturnal hypoglycemia. Pre-meal dose adjustments when eating within 2 hours of exercise are similar to the advice given for people on insulin injections on slides 27 and 28. Regarding basal rate, a 50 to 100% reduction in basal rate would be recommended between 15 to 30 minutes before exercise, with a view towards restarting 15 minutes before the end of exercise, and particularly for longer duration of exercise, consideration of a temporary basal rate reduction to 80% of usual between 10 o'clock at night and 3 o'clock in the morning are worth considering. So to summarise, this table gives some of the advantages and disadvantages of the various strategies employed during moderate exercise, including reducing the pre-exercise bolus insulin, reducing pre-exercise basal insulin, taking extra carbohydrate, sprints either before or after aerobic exercise, the benefits of insulin pump therapy, and also reducing basal insulin post-exercise. It's important to recognise that everyone's slightly different, and finding out which strategies work for you is very important. It's always important to check glucose regularly, either with fingerstick testing or, if you have the opportunity, with continuous glucose monitoring. You may wish to consider sprints to reduce the risk of hypoglycemia, and you might also wish to consider avoiding injecting your insulin in exercise areas, that is, into the leg, for example, if you are about to go running, as that will increase the rate at which the insulin is absorbed. And it's always worthwhile considering adjusting your insulins and taking carbohydrate as indicated in some of the previous slides. There are a number of sources of information regarding exercise and diabetes, and one of the longest established and best is runsweet.com, which is run by Dr. Ian Gallen. And there's more information on managing diabetes and incorporating exercise into your routine at teambloodglucose.com. If you have any questions about exercise and diabetes and you are attending the Royal Infirmary Diabetes Clinic, then feel free to contact us at the following email address.